Ambassador Richard Benedick, a senior fellow at the World Wildlife Fund Conservation Foundation and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Eileen Clausen, Director of Atmospheric and Indoor Air Programs at the United States Environmental Protection Agency in Washington. Dr. David Swanson, Senior Vice President at Edison Electric Institute, the principal association for investor-owned utilities. Dr. George Woodwell, Director of the Woods Hole Research Center in Massachusetts and an internationally known ecologist. Our moderator tonight is Bruce Smart, Senior Counselor at the World Resources Institute in Washington and a former Undersecretary of Commerce. A word about format. We've asked Bruce to play a role tonight, that of White House Chief of Staff. He's tough, he's sharp, and he's not at all convinced that the issue of global climate change is for real. Before he advises the President on anything, he's got to be persuaded. So he's convened this group of advisor experts. He's got two big questions on his mind. Is global climate change really happening? And if it is, what should we do about it? So gather round, pull up a chair, and let's watch how the nation's environmental policy gets thought through.
Thank you all very much for coming to join us in the West Wing of the White House. Probably some of you think of it as the right wing of the White House. But in any event, we have a very important problem that the President must make a decision on behalf of the country. We hear on the one hand that there is a real problem, that the atmosphere is changing, that the planet is warming, and that dire consequences will result. On the other hand, that this is not a proven problem, maybe not even a real problem, and attempting to address it now is going to cost a great deal of money and push us further into the recession that we're already in. Clearly a very important decision. I'd like to start out in preparing myself to advise the President by knowing more of what you think of this problem. And so let's start out by saying, what is the greenhouse effect? What are the greenhouse gases? And perhaps, Dr. Woodwell, you're the best position of anybody to explain that to us.
Well, the greenhouse effect is the warming of the Earth due to the accumulation of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. These gases are being produced by human activities. Carbon dioxide is one of these. The concentration of carbon dioxide has gone up in the past century by more than 25%. We have increased the concentration of methane, the second most important heat-trapping gas, by more than 100% in the course of a century or so. And we have added, for instance, CFCs to the atmosphere, which never were present before. CFCs are the chlorofluorocarbons. They're also greenhouse gases.
But wait a minute. Here we have these gases being added over 100 years of industrial activity. And with the exception of this thaw we have in Maine right now that I hear about, there really isn't a lot of evidence the world's getting hotter. How would one of you respond to that? Is this really happening, or are we just thinking it might happen?
Well, we've had 7 of the hottest years in 130 years, all since 1980. That's pretty good evidence that the world is getting hotter. The hottest year was 1990, by the way.
Eileen, you were...
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's the right question to ask.
What should I be asking? What should we know?
Well,
Tell us what you think.
It seems to me that most of the world scientists have agreed that there will be some warming sometime in the future, and there's a lot of argument about whether it's 1% or 3% or 5% or more, and there's some argument about when it's going to take place. But everyone agrees that it will take place, so I think the real question is, what ought we to do about it? And that's what we should focus on.
But I hear a lot of people saying it isn't. There are television programs and everything else coming out that it isn't.
Bruce, I'm not sure that there's still a Flat Earth Society out there, but for a long time there was. And I think that at least 95% of the scientific community, George may dispute me, he may think it's a little bit higher, but as a non-scientist, I think at least 95% of the scientific community worldwide does believe that there is this problem. No one seriously disputes that greenhouse gases will cause a warming. And I think the issue is when will it come, and what can we do about it now? And we shouldn't be looking at the last 7 years or the last 100 years, because these trends are very long-term, and what we do now will determine what happens in the next 100 years.
David, you're from industry, and I hear a lot of industry people saying the opposite.
Well, in the face of certainty of 95% confidence levels here, let me throw in a little confusion just to clear up the water. Information is a dangerous thing, because information creates the perception that if you got it, you got the answer. But what George said is very interesting, that the temperatures have been rising over the last 7 years. Last 7 years have been the hottest on record. Temperature measurement is far from an exact science. There are satellites now that have been designed specifically for examining the temperature of the air surrounding the Earth. And George, I don't believe that the satellite data backs up that particular claim, that there have been fluctuations over the last 15 years, but you don't see any strong trend line.
Although satellite data apply only to 10 years, and a 10-year sample is a very short sample, they also don't measure the same temperature. They measure a temperature far higher in the atmosphere than the temperatures reported in this study that I just cited. So they're substantially irrelevant.
If we're going into the President of the United States, though, we want to make sure that we got our thermometer stuck in the right place, because the requirement that we have here is that if the thermometer is up in the atmosphere or down on Earth, which is the one that's most important in terms of what the consequence of our decisions are going to be? I mean, that, I think, is not something that you walk away from.
David, we're not looking for a 10-year trend or even a 100-year trend from the past. And Bruce, I'm just reminded, I have a sense of déjà vu here, because I can remember 3 years ago when I was with the State Department and you were in the Commerce Department. We were sitting in your office talking about the ozone layer. And there was not a shred of evidence at that time, of hard evidence, that the ozone layer was being destroyed or that there were any harmful impacts from ultraviolet radiation. In fact, the only evidence that was there was that ultraviolet radiation measured at the Earth's surface, instead of increasing, was actually decreasing. But the scientists were telling us that there was a risk, and we looked at that risk and we had to decide on something to do, because if we didn't take out some kind of an insurance policy by doing some actions, then the risk of irreversible effects was there. And I think it's a very analogous situation, and we decided to take action on ozone.
Well, ozone is a simpler issue. The chemistry is less difficult to understand. It was generally accepted as being a possible hypothesis back in 1975 when I was in the aerosol can business. But now, this is much more complicated and much more costly to deal with. Eileen, what are we doing?
I don't think that's right.
Shouldn't we really concentrate on learning more about this and finding out where we should go and then going there? Can't we do a better job?
No. Please.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that it's useful to be more accurate and it's useful to be more precise, but I actually would take the ozone example a little bit further. We did have a series of models that would predict ozone depletion sometime in the future. When we negotiated the treaty the first time around in 1987, we didn't really consider the ozone hole. When we considered the ozone hole, we went ahead and decided to phase out CFCs internationally, but we actually have data right now that shows that we're probably going to be at about 10% depletion, which is unbelievable. We didn't have models that showed anything like that.
So the ozone case was underestimating the problem.
Way underestimated.
But can you say for sure that because ozone was underestimated, global warming might also be underestimated, or is it a different animal? It could be.
Bruce, we don't have to say for sure.
Very high.
We don't have to say for sure.
Why not?
It's a question of risk. It's like everything we do in life. It's a question of, if you wait until you're sure, then you get a very big ozone hole.
Okay, well now let's say that I accept what looks like to me a 3.5 to a half feeling among this group that this is sufficiently difficult that we ought to do something about it, or we ought to address it. But before I can go and ask the President to commit a huge change in America's economic situation and join with the rest of the world in doing it, and you know how they'll come around and ask for our money to help do what we think they should do, why is this necessarily bad? I mean, Camden, Maine might like to be a summer resort, a winter resort. It's already a nice summer resort, but it's hot in the summer with this, but it'd be wonderful in the fall and the spring. Why is it bad? What's going to happen?
You have to think about what we're doing. We're moving from what has been substantially a stable climatic system for the world into a climatic system that is patently unstable in an open-ended way, with the possibility of a continuous warming of the order of tenths of a degree to maybe a degree per decade, degree centigrade per decade, in major parts of the Earth for the indefinite future, do you think that we're going to have 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 billion people on an Earth that warms continuously year by year by year into the indefinite future? There's not a chance of it. We will drive the Earth to an impoverishment that you can't imagine, an impoverishment that will affect agriculture by depleting water reserves in continental centers, an impoverishment that will affect forests, changing the circulation of the oceans. We can predict for perhaps 2-degree change in the temperature of the Earth what the Earth will look like. But make it 3 degrees and we open up the Arctic Ocean in the summer. Change it from a white body to a black body. And what does that do to climates around the world? We don't have a clue.
And so you're convinced that this is imminent, that it's dangerous, and that we're very, very late in addressing it. That's the tone of your remarks.
I'm also convinced that there's a series of positive feedbacks, as scientists would call them, changes in the Earth as a result of the warming that will make the warming proceed more rapidly.
Like driving carbon dioxide out of solution in the ocean into the atmosphere to be
and driving it out of soils and forests. And there are large pools of carbon available to be mobilized that way.
But
and there's good evidence that that's happening right now.
If this has been happening, why haven't we, until these few years, which are cited as being a little warmer, and now it's warm in the winter, why hasn't this happened 20, 50 years ago in a way that people would notice and take cognizant of? Could this just be sunspots or something else that adjusts the climate and it'll go right back down and be cold again?
Well, that's a really good question. Let me answer that, Richard. May I answer that? It's a really excellent question. It gets right to the core of why this is an important problem and why now. There are many factors that affect the temperature of the Earth. There's no question about that. And the question is, when have we changed the composition of the atmosphere sufficiently with reference to these heat-trapping gases for that effect to dominate? That's now. We have done it. We're there.
So you're saying that we've come up to a point and suddenly we've hit a tripwire.
That's exactly it, Bruce. Nature is not always very comfortable and convenient in giving us an early warning signal. It's what the scientists would say, it's nonlinear. You go up to a point, for example, the Antarctic ozone hole, at the point that chlorine concentrations over Antarctica reached 2 parts per billion. That's not a hell of a lot. It was gradually accumulating up to 2 parts per billion. When it reached 2 parts per billion, there was a sudden and abrupt collapse in ozone over Antarctica. Before that, there was no warning. And I think that's the danger that George.
You spent a tremendous amount of time with that ozone thing. You negotiated the treaty, and I have to respect your knowledge of the subject. But we still don't have the American people convinced that this is a problem. Why is it bad if it warms up? Dr. Woodwell says people can't survive, but people in Maine or Quebec, someplace like that, might give up hockey, but they could play tennis more months per year. Why is that bad? What are the problems?
It may not be bad. I mean, in politics is where you take your votes as to where you win your issues, and it may be that in Siberia you'd end up with a lot of votes for global warming. That could be the best thing that ever happened to the Soviet Union economically, because they would have a much larger breadbasket. What George is saying, I think, is very provocative, but I'm not willing to concede that it is in fact. There is very good consensus that global greenhouse gases are accumulating in a significant way. There is a consensus that it is probably going to have some effect. But then I think things start breaking down in a big hurry as to what exactly is it that's going to happen. Are we going to have one effect or another effect? Some of those are cooling. If you have cloud buildup, you have more reflection off of away from the Earth, and so you don't have the buildup underneath the clouds. I mean, the science here goes so far, and then you really run into trouble. What Richard said about having these nonlinear effects, where all of a sudden you watch a column of smoke come off of a candle, and it stays nice and smooth, and all of a sudden, bang, it breaks up. There could well be something like that. On the other hand, we may be well down on that stem. We may have a much more stable situation than one might otherwise be led to believe.
Eileen,
So we ought to bet the world.
I mean,
I'm not saying we ought to bet the
wait,
world. I
wait,
mean, I'm in a situation here where I got the smartest guy in the world.
I know you have a very
sitting
smart
next
guy
to me.
over there, and he's made up his mind, and I'm as yet unconvinced. So I have to listen to what all of you say, and I listen to what he says because he knows a lot about it. But so do all of you, and so do a lot of other Americans. Let me ask a question. I've heard a lot about the fact that if you heat up the earth, you heat up the oceans, you melt the glaciers, you melt the Antarctic ice cap, that you are going to raise the level of the sea and you're going to flood out Bangladesh and Sri Lanka and the eastern shore of Maryland and some of those other good places. What is there to all of that? Are we going to have a big flood? Should we build Noah's Ark?
not if we're prudent and do something.
Well, in other words,
Which is where I think we ought to be in the first place.
We can do something about stopping this.
Yes.
It isn't irreversible in the sense if we act now, we can at least ameliorate it.
But the longer we wait,
The worse it is and the more expensive
And the more
it is.
Okay, now let's turn to what it is that we might do.
One thing that's worth just thinking about is we always predict things will be not as bad as they turn out to be, and we always predict they'll be more expensive than they turn out to be. And so I think it's about time we started to look more
You
carefully.
haven't been in the construction business building a house recently, but
I knew there was one example.
There's an example, right. But nevertheless, let's talk now about open your minds up, forget about whether we can afford it, forget about whether it's politically possible. What are the things that should be on the table that society could do if, and I'm not yet convinced that this is real, but let's say it's real for the point of this hypothesis, because the president's going to decide that, and he's going to need to have a bunch of options. What are the things he can do? And he needs a big shopping list, and we'll winnow it down later as to what's the real world. What are the things we could do to reduce or eliminate the discharge of these greenhouse gases? Richard?
Bruce, all the data that I have seen show that the United States is probably the most wasteful user of energy, of fossil fuels, which is what generates these carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gases, in the world. Germany, Japan, Sweden, France, Italy, you name it. They all use energy much more efficiently than we do. We are very wasteful and profligate. So I would start with the president to lead a campaign for energy conservation and energy efficiency in our society to get us to the level that these other industrialized countries have reached. And by the way, with no sacrifice in standard of living. No one can seriously tell me that the Swiss or the Germans are worse off than we do. If you've traveled in Europe recently, you can see how much the dollar buys there. They're well off, and they're using much less energy and burning less fossil fuels.
Now, let's separate fossil fuels from energy, because one of the things that has been suggested is that we switch our source of energy, not stop using it, but switch it over to sources, solar, hydro, nuclear, that do not create greenhouse gases. Are those reasonable options for the president to look at?
Some of them are reasonable technical options, some of them are unreasonable political options, and that's...
Yeah, but we're not there yet. We're just saying, should they be on the table?
Absolutely.
He's the political expert. The rest of us are helping him. He's got to make that political, and we'll have to come to that because we're going to have to help him understand where the politics are. But
anything that has a zero emission of CO2 has to be on the table.
And
But you have to make sure it doesn't cause a worse environmental problem of a different kind.
Understand. But we still have the global warming, which you've told me is Chicken Little and the sky is falling, or maybe not Chicken Little, but the sky is falling. And so what's worse than that? I can't think of anything worse than that if it's as bad as George points out.
Bruce, I think it's important to ask the question, just what do we have to do to correct the problem? How big is the problem? How large a change in what we do we have to make? If we use the report of the IPCC, which is the most recent international consensus,
IPCC means?
The Intergovernmental Panel on Climatic Change. Okay. It was an institution established by the UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, and the World Meteorological Organization. And they've produced a very detailed scientific report, an excellent report, drawing that report from the scientific community from around the world. It's a political document, political response to the question I just posed. And they came to the conclusion that it would take at least a 60% reduction in the emissions of carbon dioxide to stabilize the composition of the atmosphere. It'll probably take considerably more than that. That means that to all practical purposes, we're through with fossil fuels if we're going to stabilize the composition of the atmosphere, which is the first step toward stabilizing the temperatures of the Earth. That means that the 21st century will not be the century of fossil fuels, it will be the century of the alternative sources of energy. I would advance the view that the major source of energy for that century will be solar energy, without any question.
Of course, fossil fuels are solar energy with a time delay. But here we have a world where the demographers tell us we're going to have at least twice as many people by the middle of the next century. There are people who want economic advancement. They envy our standard of living. We can cut ourselves back on the use of fossil fuels. Those people aren't going to go forward using nothing. And now you say we've got to cut it 60% from where we are now. How in God's name can we do that? Solar energy. I mean, do you want to put solar collectors all over the state of Arizona? Environmentalists won't like that.
We can't do it without both leadership on the part of the president, which hasn't been evoked so far, and
that's why we're here, incidentally.
Leadership. I'm delighted that the president is interested, and I hope he's far more effective than he has been in addressing the problem of stabilizing the U.S. budget. But
without debating the issue, the president did push a new Clean Air Act through and has made some steps there. Admittedly, we are still struggling with how do we address the global warming problem, and that's why we're here.
Very good. Yeah. I have no doubt that we could shift our emphasis from fossil fuels to solar and do it very effectively and very rapidly if we were willing to do that. Now, there are various other sources of energy that come through solar, sources of energy that can be used to drive automobiles and machinery. So on. Hydrogen, for instance. We aren't even developing the hydrogen technology. Actually, it doesn't take an enormous amount of technological development to put it into use at the moment. Most of these technological developments have been made, they're available, and could be implemented in a short time.
David, you're in the power generation business. Where do you see solar?
Well, the thing that you want to focus on in the power generation business is the ability to provide energy when energy is needed. On a very hot day in the summer, when the sun is out, you've got the capability of using a solar photovoltaic system to provide electricity to drive your air conditioner. So you've got a kind of a one-to-one correspondence there that it works. But if it's hot and it's humid and the sun isn't shining and you've got to run your air conditioner again, where does the solar energy come from? And so you end up with a situation where utilities like to have stored energy. They like to have a big power plant sitting there that's running off of a fossil fuel or a nuclear fuel or some other kind of available fuel where you've got the ability to turn it up and turn it down as it's needed. That's what we demand. If we don't demand that, then you've got a whole new story. If we decide that we're going to be responsive to the solar energy availability environment and we tune our energy requirements to that, then we don't have a problem with solar energy. But it really gets down to what you out there in the audience and what I decide to do about my own personal energy budget and when I use it. And
I want to ask a couple of questions, but I want to go back first to Eileen here on nuclear. She indicated creating a worse environmental problem than we already have, which many of you think is very, very bad. What is wrong with nuclear? Why can't nuclear do it? No discharges, inexhaustible, essentially, supply of fuel.
I guess I would have to say U.S. experience with nuclear has not been particularly positive. It probably does not mean that it can't be done, but I think the industry has a long way to go to prove that, in fact, it can be done safely. And
we've had a heck of a lot fewer accidents and people killed in nuclear than we've had in coal mines.
Zero.
No, that's not true.
I mean, that's a fact. Sure, people conceive of a nuclear plant being a nuclear bomb and killing thousands. That hasn't happened. It happened once in Russia, and some got hurt, but nowhere near as many as are killed in coal mines in the U.S. or certainly in the Soviet Union.
I'm not saying it can't be done. I think it has to be looked at more carefully, and we have to do it right this time, because what happened to the nuclear industry in the past?
Do you see a role for government in developing a safer, better nuclear technology all the way from the operation of the reactors to the disposal of the waste?
Yes, I see a role for government actually in doing a lot of things, but I do not buy Dr. Woodwell's sort of catastrophic scenario that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there are huge numbers of things that can be done to cut down emissions of CO2, cut down emissions of methane, not at a big cost, but at a profit. And we haven't looked at any of those.
Now, we talked about all these greenhouse gases, and CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, are one we've done something about. Ambassador Benedick, you were the guy that did it, one of the guys that did it, and it's going to be done. How quickly?
Well, once again, we heard the same kind of arguments from industry, from a wide range of industries: chemicals, plastics, healthcare, food, transportation, electronics. They were all telling us it was impossible. There were no substitutes online, the technology wasn't adequate, the cost would be astronomical, the unemployment, the same arguments you're hearing today. And we gritted our teeth, and we gave the market the right incentives by saying that CFCs should be phased out by the year 2000, by the end of the century, 10 years. And lo and behold, wonder of wonders, I have great faith in Yankee ingenuity and in industry, and they're coming up with the answers. When you change the market and make the market work for you, industry with all of their financial and intellectual and technological resources can come up with the answers, and their fears, their exaggerations turn out to have been far overblown.
But actually, the 2000 date came after a fair amount of analysis that showed that it could be done.
But initially, they certainly didn't think so.
No, the industry said it.
Yeah, but I've got to pick you up on that, because back before I was in the government here, I was in the metal can business. We made aerosol cans. And S.C. Johnson, company that uses aerosol products, decided when they heard about this possibility unilaterally to discontinue the use of CFC propellants. We redesigned our cans to do that long before, 10 years or more before there was any real requirement to do so. I think industry, given the proper incentives to do this, doesn't want to be the bad guy. They're people like the rest of us. How can we help them to do it?
Bruce, the president that just issued an exhortation, a little bit of real leadership on these kinds of problems.
Bruce, you talk about, someone mentioned about the people in the audience and the people out there, individuals having responsibility. The story about the ozone layer and CFCs, the first theories came out in 1974, and they were very hypothetical. And somehow they were picked up in the media and by scientists such as George and others, and Sherry Rowland out in California, and a number of others, and it somehow captured the imagination of the American public, and within 2 years, the market for CFC aerosol sprays was cut by 2/3 between 1975 and 1977 before there was any government regulation, and it was because of tens of millions of individual decisions of consumers and people like you and me who went to their supermarkets and to their drugstores and said, we're not going to buy those products. And that gave industry a very clear signal.
But I would argue
and
also
you went out and did the right thing.
Argue
so
that it was Sam Johnson who pointed out that
it
it could be done, and the others went ahead and did it
people
too.
Can make
Let's look at some real specifics. You can replace every incandescent bulb in your house with a compact fluorescent and save 300 pounds of CO2 a year. The University of California at Berkeley put energy-efficient lighting in all of its buildings and saved as much CO2 as 1,750 cars would emit in the course of a year. These are real things. There is really technology there. And people haven't done it for a set of really bizarre reasons that I can't really fathom, because it would save them money in the long run.
We agree with you, Eileen, exactly. In fact, the utility industry over the last 10 years has developed 1,300 different kinds of conservation programs that are available for consumers to use. You've probably heard about them. The biggest problem that we have found is that it really does come down to whether or not you're willing to go out and buy that $20 light bulb.
Which will save you money in electric bills
Absolutely.
to far exceed the $20.
How do you create the market incentive to do that? How do you really convince people that that is a smart thing for them to do? That's a lot of money to spend for a light bulb, but still, you can demonstrate very easily that it's cost effective.
David, aren't some utility companies, electric utilities, in fact, providing the light bulbs to their consumers and then having them pay it back through the savings that they gain in the electric vehicles. That's a very good example, I think, of innovation by private industry.
I can give you another example, and this is sort of the government exhortation example. I mean, I actually one of my programs is to get corporations to install energy-efficient lighting, and we've got 35 major corporations signed up to replace all the lighting in all of their facilities. And what we're providing is technical assistance and sort of a green stamp of approval. And these companies are all running to sign memorandums of understanding with us and replace every single light bulb.
One of my problems personally is I don't know where to buy them. And
Yeah, actually,
we can help you. Good, okay. And I think there may be a real role for energy companies and others to say, to work with the light bulb makers, GE and so on. Here's how this kind of conservation can be done. We've talked about alternate sources of energy. They have to be on the table. We've been talking now about conservation. People save partly because they think it's a good thing to do. Mostly they save because it's in their own interest, usually in their own pocketbook's interest. What can we do in that direction in the government to put economic incentives to do these things that you say should be done and put the market to work in our favor as opposed to relying on voluntarism, either by the corporation or by the consumer?
I think what George said about presidential leadership is very important. I think it's important to have the leadership of this country define the objectives, define the direction that we're supposed to go. I think what's also true is that any leader who gets himself too out front of his constituents is doomed not only to personal failure, but to a very serious effect on the cause that they want to advance. In a democracy, you really do have to sense where the people are, and you have to be pulling them in the direction that you want to go with a kind of a firm but a gentle kind of a leadership. We do not have the ability in this country to force very many things. And so what you have to be careful of in these kinds of issues is to make sure that the people are with you, and then you can get an awful lot done. It's been very interesting for our industry to see what has happened on clean air-related issues over the last 20 years.
Does the Clean Air Act have anything to do with global warming? Is that going to help at all, or is that something entirely different to do with smog in Los Angeles?
Smog is a greenhouse gas.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it has something to do with it.
There are very strong incentives under the Clean Air Act for conservation programs. You can earn allowances.
Our Clean Air Act is probably as vigorous as any legislation of that type in the world. Is that correct?
Believe me, it's tough.
Okay.
And we've barely begun.
So that the United States,
Thank you.
The United States administration has at least taken a step forward here that is, I'm sure you'll agree, is not all that some of you'd like, but at least is better than if it hadn't been done.
No, there's something that we haven't talked about at all, and that is that the U.S. is 21% of the problem, as we put it. But what about the rest of the world, and how are we going to get the rest of the world to move in what we think is the right direction? That's something we haven't talked about at all, and that's really
assuming that we all agree what the right direction is. That's a very good point. This is really an international problem. We could stop entirely with fossil fuels, and it wouldn't. The Chinese and the Russians would burn us up with what they discharged. How do we go about that? Richard, your title is ambassador. Tell us, sir.
Right now, even as we're talking here, there is an international negotiating session taking place outside of Washington with nearly 100 countries represented, and it's the opening round of negotiations on arriving at crafting a treaty to meet Georgia's problem of global warming. And you're getting countries from all over the world, and they are discussing how to go about it. And it's interesting that in that constellation of national positions, the U.S. is generally considered not to be at the forefront. In fact, a coalition of other industrialized countries, the Europeans, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, are prepared to accept firm targets for reducing carbon dioxide emissions by the year 2000 or shortly thereafter.
And I've been
they're already at lower levels of use, and they're willing to go down further.
I've been cited as being at ground zero of this particular problem. And maybe they would like me to be at ground zero of another event. But if I am concerned, what you are proposing, cutting fossil fuels by 60% or shifting entirely to renewable sources or to a safe nuclear, says to me that we have got to change our love for the automobile, We've got to look for automobiles that get 60 and 70 miles to the gallon, technically possible. We've got to change how we heat our houses. We've got to change the relative location of our homes and our jobs. We've got to replace superhighways with monorail or what have you, mass transit. We have to make tremendous changes at very great capital cost in the United States system, and we've got to do it in a way that we harness the public sector, because you're not going to do it by government edict. Anybody who orders people to give up their cars or their trip to Florida is going to be unelected tomorrow morning. What do we do?
We're not talking about that. The 60% that George refers to, which, by the way, is not totally agreed, but let's accept it, is not something for next year or the next 10 years. It amounts to maybe a 1% per year reduction in
For 60
emissions.
years.
Yeah. We're talking about, but the things we do now have effects in the future. We're not going to turn around our transportation sector or our housing sector overnight, but at least we can start. If we don't start, we're just postponing.
I haven't heard any of you say what some of the people have said that I've had in here before. I haven't heard one of you mention the pricing of energy. People respond to prices. When I was in the paper business and the Gulf first oil shock came, we cut by about 50% the amount of energy per ton of paper because it was in our economic interest to do it. Now, is there a way that we can price this energy differently? The Europeans charge $3, $4 a gallon for gas. Most of that is taxes. We get, however, outcries over a nickel a gallon tax. But nevertheless, what would happen if we charged a big extra premium because energy is harmful? We need to ameliorate that. We need some money. It's better than charging, I'd rather charge it there than lower the tax on capital gains. We'd be all be better off.
Well, we learned a lesson in the electric utility industry in 1973 through 78 when the price of oil quadrupled. We found that there was far more price response in the system than we had guessed, and what happened was that an awful lot of capacity that we had been planning was deferred or canceled. People do respond when money is on the table. Problem is, how do you decide that you're going to jack up the cost of something in order to get a public sort of a social issue settled as a result of it? I remember when I was working out of the White House, and we had to go up and lobby for a 5-cent a gallon gasoline tax in order to rebuild the bridges and roads of this country. This was not for a deficit reduction. This was just to rebuild bridges and roads, and all we wanted was a nickel. I'm telling you, we were up all night long. There was a bloody battle just before Christmas. I mean, it was terrible.
It's
and I
called
thought,
presidential leadership.
No. The President of the United
sort
States
of
was out there doing it. And what we found was that when congressmen and senators went down to the well to vote, they kept thinking, oh my gosh, this is my job.
We need the
and
sort
that
of
really gets down to us. That really
Dr.
gets
Woodwell,
down to
I hear you calling for the return of the great communicator. Is that...
We need the type of leadership on this topic that succeeded in leading us into a war in Iraq.
effective leadership.
Saddam Hussein, that's the guy.
Bruce, wait.
There's more in that than you think.
Come back here.
Can we
Come back to
Yeah,
your
okay,
question.
okay, sure, please.
If we were to charge more for gas in this country, I think that the result would be consumer pressure on Detroit to come up with more efficient vehicles.
I'm sure you're right.
As it is, that doesn't exist.
I'm sure you're right.
And Detroit would find that they could do it just like the Japanese can.
There'd be more than that. I happen to have to build a new laboratory in Woods Hole at 42 degrees north on the coast of New England. And we've looked into the question of how we would get electricity in a new laboratory if we had our druthers. It turns out that with maybe a half an acre of land in this laboratory, we can produce using solar panels and using these conservation techniques, some of which have been mentioned here, really stringent conservation techniques, enough electricity so that we can sell electricity to this gentleman over here from our own institution. Now, we'll buy some of it back on occasion because there'll be some dull days and we'll use electricity at night. But we can do that. We can come out ahead. We can also heat the building ourselves and produce all our own water on the same site. We're practically independent of municipal services. That means a revolution in how we build cities, how we do things. It means half of his equipment is obsolete already, and I'm just working fast to make it obsolete faster.
Okay.
You might succeed.
Now, that's fine, and you're doing that. But Joe Sixpack doesn't seem to be doing that. He's lobbying his congressman, I don't want even 5 cents a gallon tax on gasoline, let alone $2 or $3, which would really bring along these more fuel-efficient cars. President's got a problem. Let's say that he goes along with what seems to be the sense of this group and the Congress out there and says we ought to do these things. And let's say that he takes lessons from his predecessor in California and he becomes a brilliant orator. He's a pretty good orator now, but he's got a lot of things on his mind besides this one issue. How are we going to get the American people to go along? The argument came through here, you put economics or you put whatever, but that's a big, big change, and it's money out of the pocket. It's the $20 light bulb. People are going to say you're out of your tree spending $20 for a light bulb. How do we do that? Politically, how do we do it? Leadership, how do we lead them? What should we say?
Leadership means, in the first
doesn't mean turning off the lights in the White House.
No, we've seen that. But it means taking the problem seriously, admitting that there is a problem. And I should say that this first step is on the way. Clearly, the U.S. position at the negotiations taking on right now is admitting that there's a problem.
We're spending a lot more on research on this subject than anybody else, and the more you know about it, the more effectively you can address it.
That's correct. But there are also actions, as Eileen points out, there are actions that we could take in the short run in terms of aiming for energy efficiency and conservation, which would undoubtedly save us money. And I think the President could be in the lead in this. He could form he could call a council of business, labor, and consumer groups to come up with a practical program which would also have hearings and get people involved. That's the way you build up public opinion. Leadership doesn't mean following the public opinion polls. It means influencing public opinion. It means educating the public.
You know, there's another thing that we've really neglected here. We've spent all our time talking about CO2, and I agree it's half of the problem, but we talked a little bit about CFCs, that's 14%. We've not talked about methane, which is 18 or 19%.
Okay, let's talk about methane.
And that's something where the opportunities are enormous. And
isn't that mostly cows?
Well, it's partly cows, and actually, if you increase, people shouldn't laugh, if you increase the productivity of cows and feed them better, there's less methane. And there's actually been a very interesting study done in India where milk production went up by 30%. Because they fed the cows a better kind of feed, and methane went down 60% as a result, because you needed fewer cows for more milk. So there actually are lots of intelligent things that you could do. Maybe half of the methane problem comes from natural gas leaks from pipelines in Eastern Europe. Why can't we work with the Poles and the Russians and others to clean up the pipelines? Methane from coal mines in China is really a problem. The Chinese don't know how to deal with the methane. Why don't we work with them on a technological basis?
American companies are collecting the methane from coal mines and selling it.
In the United States, but in China, which is where they use a great deal of coal, they're not, because they don't consider the methane. They actually they look at coal production, they have coal quotas, and they don't consider the methane.
You're talking about this international aspects of this. Why don't we do this with the Chinese, this with the Eastern Europeans, this with the Brazilians or the Indians and the methane?
Right. Because China is 7% of the problem, and India is 4%, and Brazil is 4%. Altogether, that's almost as much as Europe is as a whole.
So
there's another part of that methane story that really is pretty threatening, and that is the simple fact that methane is a product of anaerobic decay. Wherever anaerobic decay occurs, now anaerobic decay is decay where there's little oxygen available, in bogs and marshes and soils. Wherever there's organic matter and not much oxygen around and the circumstances are right for decay, it occurs, and methane is one of the products. The rate of decay depends on temperature. Warming the earth just a little bit can double or increase by 10%, and a 10% increase is a big change. and that produces more methane into the atmosphere in a short time. And scientists who address this sort of problem recognize that there are large reservoirs of carbon available in shallow waters that will be, or are very likely to be, released into the atmosphere as methane by a warming of the Earth. So this is one of those positive feedbacks that's likely to make the problem worse. As the Earth warms, it'll make the Earth warmer. So that's why scientists say there's a very, very serious problem here. And the gap between what the scientists are saying and what the governments are doing is very large, and it's getting larger.
Yeah, but I'm the president. I got to advise the president, and he has a bunch of problems, one of which happens in late 1992. He's quite interested in that. Earlier than that, there's an international conference in Brazil where the United States will be expected to have an environmental program that will be, in effect, the administration's environmental program on which they will run. So we have until then to develop all of these alternatives, to cost them out, to sell them to the American people, to sell them to the Congress, and perceive to be moving in the direction that you are attempting to convince me we should move.
Actually, it's more than that, because I think we also have to convince the rest of the world in the same time frame.
Okay, so there's a huge selling job here. Now, when you're trying to sell something, you don't try to sell 85 different pieces of it. What would be the most significant three things, let's say, that we in this administration could do that would move this forward, assuming that we agree with your consensus that it's a problem? What would be the three things that we might do as the linchpins of this program?
I think it's key to understand that the problem is urgent. It's a deadly serious problem of the same order as nuclear war, the population problem, the general problem of biotic impoverishment globally. And it requires extraordinary efforts at governmental levels and at grassroots levels.
Okay, let me ask you a question, and I'll ask each of you. On a scale of 1 to 10 on environmental threats, a lot of them, where would you put this issue? Richard?
9 or 10.
Eileen?
9.
David?
Probably about at 7.
Okay.
Well, I'd put it right up there at 10. It has the potential.
All right, now let me ask you another question. The public has got extremely excited about another environmental problem, much more than about this, and one that you could run for office on, and people are running for office on all the time. It's called the Valdez oil spill. Where would you put this on 1 to 10 in nuclear threats? Not nuclear, sorry, environmental threats.
About a 4.
2.
2.
The two are not unrelated. They are related.
They are related.
Yeah, they are related.
Well, they're related in the sense that you're moving a fossil fuel and you're burning a fossil fuel. But that would probably not be that particular route, the first one we would discontinue if we reduced our use of oil.
Sure, it's a lesser problem, 4 or 5, something in there. Serious problem, major
Okay,
contributor.
but what
to
we're really saying is this is far higher in the minds of each of you than that, but there's trouble getting it across to the American people. How are we going to do that?
The trouble is because this is we're not used to thinking in the long term. It's a question of a short-term perspective, whether it's a short-term industry perspective looking to the next quarterly profit and loss statement, or a long-term or a long-term risk. And so we're talking about a long-term risk, and we're not used to thinking. Politicians are looking to 1992, to the next election. They're not really used to thinking in terms of the long
Are the American people used to
that's
thinking
correct.
in the long term?
And we have to educate them.
Yes, David.
The only way that you're going to be able to get any kind of a consensus amongst the American people is to develop consensus amongst the, quote, experts. And what you find is that as you go through a spectrum of issues, you can get agreement on some issues. And those issues then are accepted by the American people as being, they have to be addressed. Okay? As you start going farther, then you find that your consensus starts evaporating. You find some scientists fighting with other scientists because they don't agree with them. The models aren't good enough or something or other, they don't agree with them. And so the American people say, well, geez, I mean, what do I do about this? The scientists can't agree, and I don't know enough about it to make a decision. Politicians are thinking the same thing, by the way. So they don't want to make a decision. But where we can find consensus amongst experts, and where we can find consensus amongst things that should be done, even though we don't have enough information, those are places that we ought to put stakes in the ground and say we're going to do that. On energy efficiency, we're there. There's no question we're there. Now we have to start developing a better attitude in the American people that this is something that should be done, it's smart to do, and you got to be a part of the game.
We have only an hour in these White House meetings, and then we got to go meet on something else. In 30 seconds, what would you tell a president if you had that much time with him?
Bruce, I would tell him that in 1987, President Reagan, who was not known to be enthusiastic about regulating industry, overruled many of his own advisors who were opposed to the Montreal Protocol, including his own science advisor, and decided to go ahead and act on the basis of his assessment of the risk and control CFCs. I think he did the right thing. It was a prudent decision. It was an insurance policy against future risks. And I would tell the President now that we should do no less now than what President Reagan did 3 years ago on another similar issue.
George, in 30 seconds, what would you tell him?
Well, I'd say two things. First, all these techniques for moving away from fossil fuels are available. They're also a lot cheaper than they appear to be on the surface. We will wind up saving money. Individuals will save money. It is clearly economically advantageous at the moment to start that process. Second, I'd point out that there is enormous industrial potential in making that transition, and that as we allow time to pass and don't develop the alternative technologies, we're losing in the international competition for industry and commerce. And that is a stupid national stance.
He's given you more than 30 seconds. David gave some good advice. I'm going to skip him. And Eileen, you may actually have a chance to give him 30 seconds or even a little more, but give us 30 seconds right now.
Let's try. I tell him to be a leader and take a chance. I tell him not to underestimate American industry or the American public. And I would tell him, for heaven's sakes, do something.
That's very good advice. We will listen to it. We cannot tell you what he is going to decide. All I can say is that you have been articulate, informed, and I have learned a lot from it. And thank you very much. It is, however, still the West Wing of the White House. Hopefully it serves all the American people, not just the right.